Hello, and welcome to Amplifying the Voices of African Researchers, a podcast series by the Climate and Development Knowledge Network Africa, where we spotlight emerging science evidence, highlight local knowledge, and amplify African-led research shaping climate action across the continent. This early career fellowship is supported by the International Development Research Center and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Thanks for making our podcast part of your routine. I'm your host, Herein, and in each episode, we sit down with experts, especially early career researchers, who are shaping Africa's climate future through groundbreaking and policy-relevant research. On today's episode, we are going to discuss more about energy transition, specifically in the Niger Delta extractive communities of Nigeria. So we are joined by Olumide, who's going to delve more into how we can achieve an inclusive and just energy transition in Africa. Welcome, Olumide.
Thank you, Hema. I'm glad to be here. My name is Olumide Onitekum from Nigeria. I'm a graduate of economics, master degree in economics from University of Ibadan, Nigeria. I currently work as a research and policy officer with the Africa Policy Research Institute, a Berlin-based think tank that provide African voices where African voices is often not heard. We basically shape the European Union policymaking process for African continent.
That's fantastic. A very interesting background. And now let's delve into your research. Tell us how we can achieve this inclusive and just energy transition as you are starting from Nigeria.
Yes. So the paper I will be speaking to is titled Towards Just and Inclusive Energy Transition for Niger Delta Extractive Communities in Nigeria. Over time, the justice system for communities who have been the heart of energy production in Nigeria has been largely left on the back seat in terms of decision making and the impacts of, spill, gas flare, and all that. So the research basically look at the key, for example, the Nigerian Energy Transition Plan, Climate Change Hub, and other key policies, how the host communities are being included in the energy transition process. We examine this through the use of the OECD Justice Pillar, which looks at recognitional injustice, distributive injustice, procedural injustice, and restorative injustice. So we basically look at these four key elements of justice system across relevant policies and plans in Nigeria regarding energy and energy transition.
What were the objectives of this paper and how did you achieve them?
So basically, the objective is to assess Nigeria's energy transition trajectory with respect to the inclusive and justice system of it for the Niger Delta extractive community. Niger Delta extractive communities provide about 75% of Nigeria's export honey. But then historical injustice, environmental degradation, upon livelihood, climate crisis, how they are being included in our energy transition process and planning. So we basically examine all the relevant policies, the energy transition plan, the national renewable energy and energy efficiency policy, the climate change hub, all sort of community-led initiatives, how they have been cascaded down to the vulnerable communities, particularly in the Niger Delta, who have largely been served with sort of injustice system. So we look at these policies with respect to four key pillars that was proposed by the OECD. For example, the recognitional justice. Recognitional justice simply examine the uniqueness of vulnerable communities in the planning process, in the decision-making process of energy transition in Nigeria. We examine the procedural justice. For example, procedural justice talks about how the stakeholders are being carried along in the information and decision-making process of energy transition in the country. We're talking about redistributive justice system. Redistributive justice system examine the uniqueness of each community being factored into the policy-making process of Nigeria Energy Transition Plan. And finally, I think that should be the distributive justice, which examine the costs and the benefits of energy in Nigeria. For example, the oil companies who come to harness the resources in these vulnerable communities. What cost do they have to pay for that? And who reaps the benefits of energy being used in the country? So we examine all these four pillars of justice system across various policies and initiatives in Nigeria.
Fantastic. In your course of assessing all of these four pillars, did you encounter any unexpected challenges?
Not so far from what is expected. For example, observational experience taught that largely this group of people have largely been excluded in just energy transition system of Nigeria. And Nigeria just energy transition system always advocate that they are intending to lift out 100 millions of people from poverty. But the question then goes down to probing how this is being done, how being ensured that the names of these people are being mentioned in our policies, in our plans. Because if that is done, then we can have that confidence that yes, this, the historical injustice system in these communities will be sapped. But then we observe this consistent lacuna in the policy and the plan. So this then led to the probing to ensure that, okay, let's take a closer look at this plan. Do we have some sort of this element of injustice, as earlier mentioned, captured somehow in the document? But of course, sadly, we found that most of these initiatives and plan are probably, as I may dive deeper in detail, really do not capture this sort of injustice system. Largely, the injustice system in the country, based on the plan and policy, has just been more of a paperwork, more of a talk show than the reality that is being experienced in the communities.
Great. So which approaches did you employ in collecting and analyzing data to support your findings?
So we use the Territorial Just Transition Plan Scorecard Assessment, which basically look at all these pillars of justice system that earlier mentioned, and the policies then begin to score each of those policies with respect to the pillars of justice system that we used. For example, we have the Nigerian Energy Transition Plan. We look at it, the languages used in those policies, the finance window put there, the initiatives put there. We then look at it with respect to the definition and the core pillars of the justice system, and then begin to score these elements across relevant policies and initiatives. So that's what we do. We call it Territorial Just Transition Plan Scorecard Assessment. It's basically just a score metrics where you quantify the impacts and you look at the methodology of each of these policies across the vulnerable communities.
Before we delve into your findings, how long have you been working on this project?
I led the paper with a couple of 3 other researchers. We started last year. I was actually invited, to speak at an engagement in the Niger communities on energy transition. So we started with like a stakeholder engagement in October last year. So this paper just solidifying some of the activities that were carried out at the community level, sometimes October, November last year. So I can probably peg it to about, say, a period of about 6 to 7 months.
That's good to know. Now, tell us what your paper means for the communities in the Niger Delta region. What are your findings?
Okay, just in a layman language, as I earlier explained what the 4 pillars means. Now, it's important that the host community themselves know this justice pillar so that they know what exactly they're advocating for, because it's important to know that yes, you are not being served well in your community. It's another different thing to know the global best practices on how to ensure and advocate for justice. So for the extractive communities in Niger Delta, the key findings, for example, one of the key policies that we examine is the Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan that was developed in 2022. Findings suggest that most of the engagement that informed the development of this plan highly is, top to bottom approach. The civil society group, the host community, even the private sector that could champion and lead some initiatives at the local level were not consulted, were not carried along. So we can't thoroughly say that the level of recognition of justice in that, because recognition of justice will ensure the uniqueness of each community is being captured in the plan, was not informed. The level of distributive justice, for example, which accounts for the cost and benefits, because the idea is that you bring everybody on a round table to then discuss what the best solution would be if you are trying to incorporate energy transition, trying to conduct energy transition in a particular community. Most of these stakeholders were not put together in a room to discuss and, pragmatically champion a way out of energy assets, because when we're talking about energy transition, we're just talking about energy assets, because about 52% of Nigerians do not have access to energy. So how do we address this situation? So this policy largely exclude, the oil producing communities, the extractive communities from this plan. For example, the energy transition plan, mentions some initiatives, for example, clean cooking, initiatives. Most of these initiatives were still being done in urban settings. So the oil producing communities who have produced 75% of national export earning are still being excluded in the plan and in the policy. So this is a high level of injustice system that, we are advocating for and putting it out there so that they also know what they are advocating for. For example, if you're advocating, they know they're advocating for energy access, universal modern energy access. Even though this was being mentioned in the plan, but we are now seeing that the initiative that comes after the plan is still neglecting, the justice system that needs to be served to this particular community. So what we are basically saying is that communities who have been heavily impacted by oil spills, communities who have been heavily impacted by gas flare should be included in the policy-making process, should be included in the plans. And the plan, as we see in our assessment, obviously show that these 4 pillars of justice system is largely excluded. And we can't talk about justice if these 4 pillars are not captured. So what our finding shows is that these 4 pillars are largely excluded from our plans, are largely excluded from our decision-making process, are largely excluded from our initiatives. So there's a need for us to then beginning to sign or develop a new social contract that ensures that the language, the interest, the reality of these communities are further included in the upcoming energy transition plan. Now, Nigeria is putting together NDC 3.0, the nationally determined contribution. Now, how well are we ensuring that these communities are included in this process? So that's the finding. They also talk about the key institutions, the key stakeholders, the Federal Ministry of Finance, Energy Transition Office, all the relevant stakeholders have a well-coordinated approach, because one of the key findings as well suggests that most of this initiative and activities being done in terms of energy transition is done in silos. There's no coordinated effort around energy transition in Nigeria. So we have a lot of, quite a number of recommendations that also suggest the need for some level of collaboration from the civil society groups, civil society organizations, and the government agencies. So that's at the high level, that's the key findings that we have from the paper and the recommendation. Of course, I'm happy to take questions, specific questions.
Yes, it's quite unfortunate that those who are affected by this oil spillage are left out in decision making. Could you illustrate how policymakers can include these vulnerable communities? Do you believe that stakeholders have challenges in reaching these representatives of the communities who are suffering from oil spillage? Or do you think that the neglect is actually intentional? Do you see or recognize any challenge from the perspective of policymakers?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that one of the reasons for papers like this is to advocate for the need. Because when the government, the high-level government, don't see the need, and at times it's difficult to advocate for what you have not experienced. I was privileged to be in the Niger Delta region last year, just for another research related to this, but not this research. And you could see the crisis that these people have been faced with. Now, papers like this then push the need for advocacy, push the need for how things should be done. Yeah, the government may not be aware, respectfully, how justice should be served. But papers like this throw more light on justice system that could be considered in further initiatives. But then I won't exactly say it's not intentional, because I believe other countries have done something like this. In the paper, we also look at different case studies. For example, we look at South Africa. South Africa Just Energy Transition Investment Plan included the vulnerable communities. I've forgotten the name of the exact communities as example. Communities who, because South Africa relies largely on coal. Now, these places where coal is being mined, we're talking about energy transition. That means people will have to lose their jobs. A lot of things have to change in those communities. Now, what initiative are you putting together to ensure that workers in this sector are being upskilled, reskilled, to ensure that their source of livelihood is not taken out of their hand? Now, a lot of initiatives are being put together, consultation are being done at local community level to ensure that, okay, this is the plan of the government. The global trajectory is moving towards a renewable and a cleaner energy source. So that means coal is no longer sustainable in the global landscape. So a lot of stakeholder engagement were being done with local communities and even youths to ensure that their voices are heard, to ensure that initiatives are done tailored to their need. Because initiatives are best championed when the affected people are the one advocating and calling out the things that they need. So we could see that Countries have done this. South Africa has done this. Germany has done this. So we then borrow this idea that Nigeria can leverage some of this initiative. For example, in South Africa as well, we could see that a certain percentage of allocation of finance in energy transition finance was allocated to this community, so that any money coming for energy transition, there's a particular percentage that has been allocated for this community. For Nigeria, there's no such thing. There's no allocation of finance to vulnerable communities. So these are some of the initiatives that we have recommended. But to answer your question in a nutshell, well, respectively, it's quite sad that the high-level governments are not deliberate enough and intentional, because if it were, then these things would have been captured in our previous initiatives. But then there's still a possibility this can be done. Countries have done it before. Countries are still doing it. We can borrow from, glean knowledge from them, then domesticate it into our own reality. I hope I answered your question.
Thanks for sharing the case study of other African states when it comes to energy transition. As you were speaking, you did mention about alternative upscaling. When we come back to Nigeria, are there some alternative skills that these people would be likely engaged in during the transition?
Yes, definitely. If you look at the renewable energy sector, it's largely a case study. Now, one of the major barriers to accessing clean energy, we're not just in Nigeria, in Africa, is the high upfront costs of renewable energy. Now, and I strongly believe that one of the reasons why we have that barrier is because most of the facilities being used for renewable energy, solar, for example, are imported. For example, now is the time for Nigerian government to then start thinking of how to domesticate this, how this can be produced locally. A working group can be put together to train youth across relevant community groups, particularly communities who are impacted by this, to then begin to train sort of vocational and training program for youth on renewable energy, coupling, manufacturing of batteries, manufacturing of panels, all of these things being used. A training program can be put together to ensure that skill sets are being upgraded, and so that as energy transition occurs, we have youth that can participate in the process. That has a lot of economic benefits when we begin to localize the manufacturing of all these renewable energy system and use. There's benefits on balance sheet payments. For example, import and export balance sheet is offset. Exchange rate stability, inflation, all of these ripple economic benefits are there in the economy. So the idea is just for us to put together some sort of initiatives, training programs that trains youth towards the next phase of the global energy.
Localizing solutions is the way to go. Do you have any hope for these communities? What's next for your research?
Yes, there's hope for the community, but it's not left to either the government, as I always balance off. It's not all depends on the local community as well. The government only needs to create the right environment, right incentives for community initiatives to thrive. So I strongly believe that, of course, the community also needs to know exactly what they want, what is needed for them, which is why papers like this helps, and engagement with communities like this help them to shape their narrative on how best to advocate. And there's a lot of initiative, there's a lot of potentials in this community that can be harnessed, right, in terms of even in terms of human capital. We have people in these host communities who have championed several initiatives that can be brought to limelight. So I believe there's a high hope. Government needs to put together the right incentives, the enabling environment for the private sectors. Because yes, while we could experience some limited funding from the government, the private sector has the technical expertise and the financial capabilities to deploy resources to this community and harness the resources in this community, so that at the end of the day, it becomes a shared benefit and a shared win, both for the vulnerable communities, the private sector individuals who are looking for investment opportunities, and of course, the government in the environment, because it's cycle. When all these initiatives are appropriately deployed in our communities, it offsets a whole lot of expenses from the government, and it can also bring about some sort of revenues from the government, because by the time renewable energy access is deployed to this community, it improves productivity. When productivity improves, it improves opportunities, it improves income, both for the household and of course for the government as well for the private sector from their investment. So I strongly believe all these resources, we have the resources, we have the hydro, we have the solar, we have the wind system to ensure that all these initiatives are leveraged and they are judiciously served across relevant stakeholders. Of course, we must also embed the rural communities. in the picture. So everybody have their roles to play in the new phase of energy access we are talking about.
I love your conclusion where everyone has a role to play. Thank you, Olumide, for advocating for the inclusion for the Niger Delta communities and also sharing alternative strategies for improving economies for a just transition. If you would love to hear more about Olumide's project or research, you could go on the CDKN.org website and read more on the Fellowship of African Early Career Researchers. It has been such a delight and also an unraveling fact-finding segment with you, Olumide. Thank you so much for spending time with us and also talking more about your research and how to drive change where it's needed the most. This podcast is part of the CDKN Africa Fellowship, working to elevate African voices in climate science, policy, and practice. Until next time, think locally led research, publish widely, and let Africa's researchers' voice echo in every local and global climate conversation.